"Margaret, we appreciate everything you've done, but please stay out of our lives from now on," Vanessa said, her tone polite but carrying an unmistakable edge. I froze, the words hitting me like a sudden chill on a bright summer morning. The afternoon sun poured through the kitchen window, glinting off the polished granite countertops and the brass fixtures I had helped pick out months ago, yet none of it mattered. Ethan, my son, stood beside her, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, eyes cast downward, avoiding mine entirely. I had driven 3 hours that morning from my small home in East Austin, bringing a gift basket of home-baked cookies and a bottle of vintage wine I had saved for a special occasion. The scent of freshly cut flowers filled the entryway, a small bouquet I had arranged just an hour earlier, hoping to add warmth to their new house. But warmth was not on the agenda today. I set the basket on the marble island, my hands lingering briefly on the handle, feeling the familiar grooves that always reminded me of the mornings Ethan would toddle in to help me stir pancake batter when he was a boy. Those memories flashed quickly and then vanished, leaving a hollow ache behind. I smiled lightly, the kind of smile that concealed 1,000 questions, the kind that said nothing but absorbed everything. I glanced around the open-concept living room. The hardwood floors gleamed under the afternoon light. The couch cushions were plumped neatly, the dining table polished to a shine. Everything was perfect, immaculately arranged, yet the air between us crackled with tension I could not ignore. Vanessa's hand rested on the edge of the kitchen counter, her nails manicured, each one reflecting the sun in small flashes, almost taunting in their perfection. Ethan's sneakers squeaked faintly as he shifted again, and I realized he had been silent this entire time, letting her words hang in the room like an invisible barrier. I cleared my throat softly, the sound barely carrying, and said, "I thought today was about celebrating the house." My voice was steady, calm, even though inside, the old familiar rush of betrayal, disappointment, and disbelief churned quietly. Vanessa's lips pressed into a thin line, a micro-expression that might have been missed by anyone else, but I noticed, and it spoke volumes. She stepped back slightly, gesturing vaguely toward the foyer. "Of course, Margaret, we just feel it's best if we have our own space now." Ethan finally lifted his gaze, fleetingly meeting mine, a flicker of guilt, or perhaps uncertainty, crossing his face before he dropped it again. I took a slow, deliberate step toward the door, feeling the smooth brass of the knob beneath my fingers, imagining the countless times I had opened doors for family, for friends, for neighbors, always giving, always supporting, never asking. Today, I did not enter another room. I did not sit. I did not speak further. I simply exhaled and let the quiet fill the space, absorbing the sunlight, the polished floors, the soft hum of the HVAC, and their words, which replayed endlessly in my mind. My gift basket remained untouched on the counter, the wine unopened, a symbol of my care that went unacknowledged. I took a small step back, then another, turning to leave, my heels clicking softly against the hardwood, each step echoing a lifetime of devotion I had poured into this family. The driveway stretched out ahead, sun-warmed and quiet, and as I reached my car, I paused, hand on the door handle, letting my gaze drift to the house one last time, capturing every detail. The bright curtains, the gleaming counters, the brand-new appliances, all of it theirs now, all of it a reminder that generosity could be met with cold indifference. I sat behind the wheel, hands folded in my lap, breathing slowly, letting the warmth of the Texas sun calm the tightness in my chest. And then I whispered to myself, almost inaudibly, "They think I am powerless. That is their first mistake." The drive back to my house felt longer than 3 hours. The highway stretched endlessly beneath a pale Texas sky, and mile after mile rolled past while the silence inside my car grew heavier. I did not turn on the radio. I did not call anyone. I simply drove, watching the landscape blur into patches of green fields, gas stations, and distant billboards. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the sun was beginning to sink, casting long shadows across the lawn I had spent years maintaining myself. My little brick house looked exactly as it had that morning, but somehow it felt different. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The familiar scent of lemon furniture polish and lavender candles greeted me. Everything was in its place. The framed photographs on the hallway wall, the rocking chair beside the fireplace, the quilt folded neatly across the couch. I stood there for a moment, staring at the photographs. Ethan was smiling in nearly every one. A missing front tooth at age 7. A baseball uniform at 12. A graduation gown at 22. Every picture told the story of a boy I had loved more than anything in the world. I set my purse on the kitchen counter and opened the refrigerator. A container of soup sat on the top shelf, leftovers from the previous night. I was not hungry, but I warmed a bowl anyway. The microwave hummed softly while I stared out the window above the sink. The backyard looked peaceful. A cardinal landed briefly on the fence before flying away. Everything outside seemed calm. Inside, my thoughts refused to settle. I carried the soup to the dining table and sat alone. Across from me was the empty chair where no one had sat for years. Ethan used to occupy that seat whenever he visited. Back when visits were frequent. Back when he called just to talk. Back when conversations did not feel rushed or forced. I picked up my spoon and then set it back down. My appetite had vanished. Instead, I found myself remembering things I had not thought about in years. The extra shifts I worked at the hospital billing office when Ethan was young. The weekends I spent clipping coupons and stretching every dollar. The summer I postponed replacing my old car because his college textbooks cost more than expected. None of those sacrifices had ever felt like burdens. I made them gladly because that is what mothers do. They give. They support. They believe their children will remember. After a while, I stood and carried the untouched soup back to the kitchen. As I rinsed the bowl, my eyes drifted toward a small wooden box sitting on the counter. Inside were financial records, receipts, and documents I rarely looked at anymore. Something made me open it. I pulled out a folder labeled Home Purchase. The papers inside were neatly organized, exactly as I had left them months ago. There was the cashier's check. There were the transfer confirmations. There were the records showing how much of my retirement savings had gone toward helping Ethan buy that house. I ran my fingers over the numbers and felt a strange calm settle over me. Not anger. Not sadness. Something colder. More focused. Because for the first time, I stopped asking why Vanessa wanted me gone. Instead, I began wondering what they thought I would never notice. And that question stayed with me long after the house fell silent and the night settled over Austin. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. The sky outside my bedroom window was still gray, and the neighborhood remained quiet except for the distant sound of a delivery truck moving down the street. I brewed a pot of coffee and carried a mug to the kitchen table along with the folder of documents. For years, I had trusted that helping Ethan build a better future was the right thing to do. I never expected gratitude. I never expected repayment. But trust is a strange thing. You do not realize how much of it you have invested until someone starts withdrawing it without permission. I opened the folder again and reviewed every page carefully. The transfer records were exactly where I remembered them. The down payment assistance, the moving expenses, the furniture contribution, one expense after another. At the time, each payment felt like a celebration, a milestone, a mother helping her son achieve something meaningful. Now those same numbers seemed to tell a different story. Around noon, I drove to a small diner a few miles from my house. It was a place I had visited for years, the kind of restaurant where the waitresses remembered your name and refilled your coffee before you asked. As I slid into a booth near the window, I noticed a familiar face entering through the front door. Linda Harper. She lived 2 streets over and had known Ethan since he was a teenager. She spotted me immediately and smiled. "Margaret, mind if I join you?" she asked. I welcomed the company. We spent a few minutes talking about ordinary things. The weather, local traffic, rising grocery prices. Then her expression shifted slightly. "I almost saw Ethan and Vanessa last weekend," she said casually. I looked up from my coffee. "Almost," Linda nodded. "They were at a neighborhood barbecue near their subdivision. I was invited by a friend." Something in her tone caught my attention. "How did they seem?" I asked. Linda hesitated. "Happy enough, I suppose. But there was something odd." I waited. She stirred her iced tea slowly. Vanessa kept telling people how proud she was that they had built everything on their own. The words landed quietly, but they settled heavily. Linda continued. "At first, I thought nothing of it. Then someone asked whether family had helped them get started. Vanessa laughed and said they had always preferred complete independence." I felt my fingers tighten slightly around my coffee mug. Not enough for anyone else to notice. Just enough for me. Independence. The word echoed in my mind. Linda looked uncomfortable. I am sorry, Margaret. Maybe I should not have mentioned it. I forced a small smile. No, I am glad you did. We changed the subject after that, but my thoughts remained fixed on those comments. On the drive home, I replayed every conversation I had ever had with Vanessa. Every polite smile, every carefully chosen phrase, every subtle distance she created between Ethan and the people who cared about him. None of it had seemed significant on its own, but viewed together, the pattern became impossible to ignore. By the time I pulled into my driveway, a realization had settled firmly in my mind. Vanessa did not simply want space. She wanted a new version of their story, one where no one remembered who helped build the foundation beneath their success. And as I stepped out of the car, I found myself wondering how many other details had quietly disappeared from that story without my knowledge. That evening, I stayed in my home office, the room dimly lit by a single desk lamp. I spread the folder of financial documents across the oak desk and reviewed them once more, line by line, noting every contribution I had made toward Ethan's new house. It was meticulous work, and I took my time, not rushing. Each number told a story of dedication, long nights working overtime, skipped vacations, and careful budgeting. I realized that no one else could see the care hidden within these figures, but I could. I made a cup of chamomile tea, steam curling gently upward, and sipped slowly as I flipped through the pages. My mind drifted back to moments when Ethan had first mentioned wanting to buy a house. He had been enthusiastic, imagining the open floor plan, the backyard for his dog, and the modern kitchen. I had encouraged every idea, offered advice, and quietly contributed more than he knew. Now, the same enthusiasm seemed hollow. The house existed, the keys were in their hands, yet the connection I thought we shared was fractured. I placed the documents back in the folder and considered my next steps carefully. Instead of anger, a calm determination settled over me. I would not confront Ethan or Vanessa with raised voices or accusations. That was not my way. Instead, I would observe, understand, and act with purpose. Later that night, I went through my address book, identifying those I could quietly consult. Linda Harper came to mind immediately. I called her and arranged to meet the next morning for coffee. As I hung up, I glanced at the small wall calendar above my desk, noting upcoming deadlines and reminders, most of them trivial, but today they carried weight. The past few days had revealed patterns that were impossible to ignore. A quiet calculation had begun to emerge, a way to see how much influence I truly had and how my actions could regain balance without drama. I walked through the living room, noticing the shadows cast by the evening light on the couch and walls, and reflected on past family gatherings, casual conversations, and the subtle shifts in Ethan's demeanor after Vanessa became more involved. None of it was dramatic, yet each moment now seemed like a breadcrumb leading to a larger picture. I reviewed every interaction in my mind, considering tone, timing, and context. The faint hum of the refrigerator, the occasional car passing by, and the ticking clock were the only sounds in the house. Yet I felt the presence of countless moments waiting to be acted upon. The knowledge I had was quiet, precise, and it demanded patience. I set my tea aside and pulled a blank notebook toward me, pen ready, and began outlining observations, questions, and tentative plans. I would need to verify everything, cross-reference facts, and gather any supporting evidence. Not to punish, not to shame, but to understand fully, and when the moment was right, to ensure that the truth of my contributions could not be denied. By the time the lamp cast long shadows across the desk, I felt a sense of clarity. The house, the documents, the smiles, the polite deflections, all of it fit together into a pattern I could navigate. I closed the notebook gently and leaned back, letting the leather chair cradle me. The calm I felt was not relief. It was focus, a steady awareness that the next steps would be deliberate, thoughtful, and measured. Outside, the night deepened, the neighborhood quieted further, and I realized that patience and careful observation were my allies in this unfolding story. The next morning, I met Linda at a small coffee shop tucked between a hardware store and a family-owned pharmacy. The place smelled of roasted coffee beans and fresh cinnamon rolls, and for a few minutes we talked about ordinary things. It felt comforting, almost normal. Then Linda reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. "I was not sure whether I should show you this," she said quietly. She turned the screen toward me. It was a photograph from the neighborhood barbecue she had mentioned. Ethan stood near a grill, smiling. Vanessa stood beside him holding a paper plate. Around them were neighbors I had never met. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then I noticed the caption attached to the social media post. Proud of everything we built together from the ground up. I stared at the words longer than I should have. Not because they were cruel. They were worse. They erased me completely. Linda watched my expression carefully. There were several posts. Like that, she said. I checked after our conversation yesterday. I nodded slowly and handed the phone back. A younger version of me might have felt angry. Instead, I felt something else. Confirmation. For days I had been trying to determine whether I was imagining things, whether grief and disappointment had distorted my judgment. Now I knew they had not. The pattern was real. After coffee, I drove home and spent the afternoon organizing paperwork. Bank transfers, wire confirmations, receipts, copies of emails. I placed everything in chronological order across my dining room table. The table looked less like a place for meals and more like a small investigation. As the hours passed, certain details began standing out. There were expenses I had forgotten entirely. The security deposit, the inspection fee, several large furniture purchases, a landscaping contribution after closing. One by one, the numbers added up. By sunset, I sat back and totaled everything. The amount was far larger than I remembered. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the final figure. It represented years of careful saving, years of choosing practicality over luxury, years of putting family first. My phone buzzed suddenly. A text message from Ethan appeared on the screen. Hope everything is good. Busy week here. I read it twice. There was no mention of our last conversation. No acknowledgement of Vanessa's comment. No apology. Just a casual message floating on the surface of something much deeper. I typed a short response. Everything is fine. Hope work is going well. Then I set the phone aside. An hour later, another notification appeared. This time it was a social media update. Vanessa had posted photographs from a furniture shopping trip. New dining chairs, decorative lighting, custom shelves, hundreds, perhaps thousands, of dollars in purchases. Under one picture she wrote, finally creating the home we dreamed of all by ourselves. I looked at the screen for several seconds before locking the phone. Then I walked to the kitchen and poured a glass of water. Outside, the neighborhood was settling into evening. Sprinklers clicked across nearby lawns. Porch lights flickered on. Everything felt peaceful. Yet beneath that calm surface, something important had shifted. For the first time, I stopped viewing myself as someone who had been excluded. Instead, I began seeing myself as someone who possessed information they did not realize mattered. Information supported by records, dates, and facts. Information that could not be dismissed with polite smiles or rewritten through carefully crafted stories. As darkness settled outside my windows, I returned to the dining table and opened my notebook. At the top of a fresh page, I wrote a single question. If they were willing to erase my role in building their future, what else were they willing to hide? The following week, I decided to take a different approach. Instead of calling Ethan or Vanessa, I focused on documenting everything meticulously. I sat at the dining table with the folder of financial documents spread in front of me once more. Every receipt, every wire transfer, and every bank statement was organized and double-checked. I noted down dates, amounts, and descriptions, tracing every contribution I had made toward the house, the furniture, the landscaping, and the moving expenses. My pen moved steadily across the page, and with each line I wrote, a clearer picture formed of how much I had invested, not just financially, but emotionally, mentally, and physically. By the time I looked up, the sunlight had faded and the streetlights flickered on outside, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. I set the pen down and leaned back, letting my mind replay the past conversations, the casual dismissals, and the subtle shifts in attitude I had noticed over the months. Ethan's voice, hesitant and polite. Vanessa's smooth assurances, their smiles and nods that now felt carefully calculated. I realized that for the first time, I was seeing the entire pattern, not as scattered incidents, but as a coordinated effort to rewrite the story of our family without acknowledging my role. I went to the kitchen and made a small snack, slicing a piece of bread and spreading a thin layer of almond butter, savoring the quiet rhythm of ordinary tasks. The act grounded me. Then I returned to my office. where I opened a blank notebook and began to outline questions and hypotheses. How much did they know? How deliberate were their choices? What did Ethan understand that he had never told me? Each question was written carefully, leaving space for notes, thoughts, and evidence. I realized that by tracking everything, I was gaining power silently. It was not a confrontation, nor an accusation. It was preparation, clarity, and awareness. Later, I stepped out onto the back patio. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of evening jasmine from a neighbor's yard. I watched as a small group of children played across the street, their laughter echoing faintly. It reminded me of the days when Ethan was their age, and I had watched over him with the same protective care. I closed my eyes briefly, letting memories wash over me, both warm and sharp. The time had come to shift my role from passive observer to a careful participant. I would act, but on my terms. There would be no hasty reactions, no visible frustration, no emotional outburst to hand them leverage. Instead, I would proceed quietly, methodically, ensuring that when the truth became apparent, it was undeniable and complete. The night deepened, the streetlights glowing steadily, and I returned inside, ready to begin cross-referencing every record, every post, and every conversation. I had the facts, the timeline, and the clarity to act, and I felt a quiet confidence that was unfamiliar yet welcome. By the time I turned off the office lamp, the house was silent. The furniture, the polished countertops, and the neatly stacked documents all stood as witnesses to my resolve. Tomorrow, I knew, would be the day to begin observing the impact of what I had documented, the first step toward quietly reclaiming what had been overlooked and asserting the presence that had been ignored for far too long. The change began quietly. No announcement, no argument, no dramatic conversation. One morning, I simply stopped doing the things I had always done. For years, I had been Ethan's safety net without realizing it. Whenever something unexpected happened, I was there. If he needed advice, I answered. If he needed help reviewing paperwork, I cleared my schedule. If there was a financial surprise, I found a way to contribute. None of those actions had ever felt extraordinary to me. They felt like motherhood. But as I sat at my kitchen table reviewing my notes, I realized something important. Support given freely is a gift. Support expected without appreciation becomes an obligation. And I was no longer willing to carry obligations that no one acknowledged. A few days later, Ethan called. His voice sounded distracted. He mentioned that they were comparing contractor estimates for additional upgrades. A larger patio, custom storage cabinets, new landscaping. Normally, I would have listened carefully and offered suggestions. Instead, I simply said, I hope you find an option that works for your budget. There was a brief pause on the line, almost as if he expected something more. Then the conversation moved on. When we hung up, I felt a strange mixture of sadness and relief. The following weekend, I noticed fewer messages arriving. No photographs asking for opinions. No requests for recommendations. No casual questions. The silence revealed something I had not fully understood before. Much of our recent relationship had revolved around what I could provide. Once I stopped stepping forward automatically, the communication changed. Around the same time, Linda called to check on me. We spent nearly an hour talking. At one point she laughed and said, "You sound different." I asked what she meant. "Stronger," she replied. "Calmer." After the call ended, I thought about those words. Stronger was not how I would have described myself. Yet perhaps she was right. For weeks I had been focused on understanding what had happened. Now my attention was shifting toward what would happen next. I began spending more time on myself. I joined a local gardening club. I started taking morning walks through a nearby park. I met new people. I rediscovered routines that had nothing to do with Ethan or Vanessa. The more I invested in my own life, the less power their rejection seemed to hold over me. Then one evening, while scrolling through social media, I noticed something unexpected. Vanessa had posted several photographs of recent home projects. The captions were noticeably different. Gone were the references to building everything alone. Gone were the declarations of complete independence. Instead, the posts focused on decorating choices and neighborhood events. The change was subtle, but I noticed it immediately. Perhaps she had become more careful. Perhaps someone had pointed something out. Or perhaps she sensed that the narrative she was creating contained cracks. Whatever the reason, it confirmed one thing. People rarely adjust their behavior unless they recognize a shift in the situation. I closed my phone and looked out the window. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. For the first time in weeks, I felt genuinely at peace. Not because anything had been resolved, not because anyone had apologized, but because I had stopped measuring my value through their recognition. Yet deep down, I also knew this story was far from over. Because sooner or later, reality has a way of testing every story people tell themselves. And something told me that test was coming much sooner than Ethan and Vanessa expected. The following morning, I woke to the soft hum of the air conditioner and the faint golden light seeping through the blinds. The house was quiet except for the occasional chirp of a bird outside, and I appreciated the stillness as I brewed a cup of coffee. Sitting at the kitchen table, I reviewed the notes I had made over the past several days. Observations, patterns, questions. They were all written clearly and in order, creating a map of behavior, decisions, and omissions that had seemed insignificant at first, but now revealed a larger narrative. I poured the coffee into my favorite mug, the one Ethan had given me years ago, and watched the steam curl upward, carrying with it the scent of roasted beans. I thought about the upcoming weekend, which I had previously assumed would be filled with phone calls, questions about the house, and minor favors I would have felt obligated to provide. This time, however, I resolved to maintain my routine without interruption. Instead of engaging, I would observe quietly. That afternoon, I walked through my backyard, the fresh grass still damp from an early sprinkler cycle, and made a mental note of the small repairs I had planned to do around the house. Each task was an anchor, grounding me in reality while I watched the larger story unfold. By mid-morning, I noticed a social media post from Vanessa showing the living room with new curtains and a decorative lamp, her caption emphasizing their autonomy and independence. I did not comment. I did not react. Instead, I cataloged the post, noting the date and context in my notebook. It was a small act, but it reminded me that influence does not always require confrontation. Influence can be exerted quietly, deliberately, and invisibly. That evening, I prepared a simple dinner for myself, slicing fresh vegetables and grilling a small piece of salmon. As I ate, I reflected on the subtle ways power had shifted. By stepping back, by observing, and by allowing their actions to speak for themselves, I began to understand how easily assumptions could be challenged and recalibrated. Ethan and Vanessa believed that distance meant disconnection, that absence equaled a lack of involvement. They were learning, slowly, that absence can also mean observation, understanding, and preparation. After cleaning the kitchen, I returned to the dining table and organized the photographs, receipts, and notes I had accumulated. Everything was methodical and deliberate. Nothing was left to chance. The evening deepened into night, and the neighborhood quieted, yet I felt alert, focused, and steady. The house, my home, was alive with quiet potential, and I felt ready to see how long their assumptions would hold. By the time I turned off the lights and headed to my bedroom, I felt a sense of calm power settle over me. I was no longer simply a participant in their story. I was a careful observer, an archivist of facts, and a strategist of patience. The next moves would be mine to make, measured and deliberate, and the narrative would unfold on terms they had not anticipated. 3 weeks later, the knock finally came. It was a Saturday morning, warm and bright, the kind of Texas day that usually encouraged people to spend time outdoors. I had just finished watering the flowers along my front walkway when I heard it. 3 slow knocks against the front door. I already knew who it was before I opened it. Ethan stood on the porch. He looked tired. Not older, exactly, but weighed down in a way I had never seen before. His shoulders were tense, and there were dark circles beneath his eyes. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he looked at me and said, "Mom, can we talk?" I stepped aside and invited him in. We sat at the kitchen table where he had done homework as a boy and where I had spent countless evenings helping him study, plan, and dream about his future. The silence lingered until he finally spoke. "I owe you an apology." The words were simple, but I could tell they had not come easily. He stared down at his hands before continuing. "I should have said something that day. I should have spoken up." I listened quietly. Months earlier, I would have rushed to comfort him. Now I simply allowed him to speak. "I kept telling myself it was not a big deal," he said. "I convinced myself everyone just needed space. But the more time passed, the more I realized how much you actually did for us." For me. He looked around the kitchen. I spent so many years assuming you would always be there that I stopped appreciating what that really meant." His voice cracked slightly before he regained control. I nodded but said nothing. The truth was that I had not spent these past weeks waiting for an apology. I had spent them rebuilding parts of myself that I had neglected for years. My happiness no longer depended on whether someone recognized my sacrifices. Ethan took a deep breath. Things have been difficult. I could hear the unspoken details beneath the statement. Financial pressure, stress, expectations, reality. The same reality I had quietly anticipated months ago. Every choice eventually carries its own consequences. "I am not here because I need money," he said quickly. "I am here because I was wrong." That sentence mattered more than anything else he could have said. For the first time, he was taking responsibility without asking for something in return. We talked for nearly 2 hours. Not about blame. Not about arguments. We talked about choices, assumptions, and how easy it is to overlook the people who help build the foundation beneath your success. Before leaving, Ethan stood by the front door and hesitated. "Do you think you can forgive me?" he asked. I smiled softly. "Forgiveness is not the difficult part." He looked relieved until I continued. "Trust takes longer." He nodded slowly. This time he understood. As I watched him walk down the driveway, I felt no anger, no desire for revenge, no need to prove anything. The records in my folders remained untouched. The evidence I had gathered stayed where it was. I did not need it anymore. The greatest change had happened inside me. I had learned that generosity should never require self-erasure. I had learned that love does not mean accepting disrespect. Most importantly, I had learned that my value was never determined by whether someone acknowledged it. The afternoon sun illuminated the flowers beside the walkway as I returned inside. My house felt peaceful. My life felt full. Ethan had purchased his first home with my help, but that was never the most important thing I gave him. The most valuable lesson came afterward, because losing the support of someone who truly cares for you is far more expensive than any mortgage payment. And thankfully, before it was too late, my son finally understood that.